Marines mourn Sergeant Major Jiggs, mascot of hard-hitting Corps. The New Britain Herald, January 12, 1927. Sergeant Major Jiggs was the greatest devil dog of all times. Not that the Sergeant Major, celebrated mascot of the Marines, was a devil of a dog. He was, forsooth, a good dog, and a thoroughbred to boot. When taps were sounded over the mortal remains of the Sergeant Major Tuesday morning at Quantico, Virginia, with 800 Marines standing at attention, the while his comrades lowered their mascot's remains 'neath the green-tufted earth of the athletic field, his old romping grounds, there passed into Marine history one of the greatest characters that ever wore a uniform. Jiggs was a top sergeant in every sense of the word. He had all the characteristics of men who wore the same kind of chevrons. He even smoked a pipe at odd moments. And once in a while, he took a chew of picnic twist. Though he never once tasted Navy cut, Sergeant Major Jiggs was true to the Marines. For others, it might be the Army and the Navy forever, but to the old sergeant, it was always the Marine and Semper Fidelis. Jiggs joined the Marines when he was 2 years old. General Smedley Butler, in command at Quantico, was asked by the Leathernecks to get them a mascot. There was a debate as to just what would make a good mascot for the Marines. The Navy has a goat, the Army a mule. Expert authority agreed that something significant and, if possible, symbolic of Marine standards should be adopted. During the World War, when the boys who wore the khaki went over the top and met the enemy face to face, the cohorts of the House of Hohenzollern, when they bumped into United States Marines, came to call their antagonists devil dogs. Out of this came the idea of having a bulldog for the Marine mascots. Smedley Butler and his companions in the Corps instigated a nationwide search for a dog that would be in every way typical of what Germans called the Marines. They found one in Philadelphia. He was Jiggs. Bulldogs, as a rule, are nobody's beauties. They have underslung jaws, protruding teeth, beetling brows, and cauliflower ears, enough to scare the average mortal out of his wits. Old Jiggs, even in his babyhood, was about as ugly as they came. As years fell on his shoulders and wrinkles came one by one on his wizened face, he betook unto himself a likeness that was anything but beautiful, except to the true experts who recognize in these characteristics of a bulldog the markings of a master. In his second year, Jiggs was the youngest Marine ever to enlist in the service. He was brought from Philadelphia to Quantico and placed in the ranks as a buck private. That was back in 1922. Immediately, Jiggs became a favorite with the men. He took to Marine life from the very outset and became mascot of all the various athletic teams, beginning a career that was to stamp him, at the time of his death, the greatest traveled dog ever associated with a military outfit, with one possible exception: the late Stubby mascot of the Yankee Division, AEF, from New Britain, Connecticut. Jiggs had not been a buck private very long when he was elevated to the rank of Lance Corporal by the boys who led him on a leash down at Quantico. This, of course, was more or less unofficial. But sometime later, the then Secretary of the Navy, Denby, himself once a Marine, on a visit to Quantico, thought that the dog should have a higher rating and lifted him to the rank of sergeant. About a year and a half ago, Secretary of the Navy Wilbur was down at Quantico one day addressing the boys when Sergeant Jiggs stepped out on the platform. Immediately, there was a great roar from Jiggs's comrades. Secretary Wilbur saw that he was a favorite. Noting the chevrons on Jiggs's blanket, those of a field sergeant, the head of the United States Navy asked the men if they thought Jiggs did not deserve a higher rating. They shouted in unison, "Sure, Pop." "What do you want him to be?" asked the secretary. An old-timer in the front row shouted, "Make him a top sergeant." And this is how the old fellow who died last Sunday came by his chevrons. Though Jiggs had attained the ripe old age of 8, pretty high in the kingdom of dogdom, since specimen of the bull rarely if ever lived beyond 10 years, his death, nevertheless, was considered premature by Marines who were in close contact with him. For they figured that old Jiggs was one of those institutions that, moss-covered and all as they might be, go on forever. 800 Marines at Quantico are in mourning for Jiggs. This is not the full quota usually stationed at this post. Otherwise, there would be 3,500 of his buddies mourning his loss down there tonight. At the time Jiggs decided to shake his earthly cares off his shoulders, most of the men who had grown attached to him were away from the Old Bailiwick. 2,500 of them were doing duty throughout the 48 states guarding the mails. Another batch was plowing its way through the Gulf Stream going to Nicaragua, where there are momentous happenings. Still another complement was on the high seas headed for the tropical posts in South America and out-of-the-way stations in China. All Marine posts and ships were notified by radio of Jiggs's death. Old Jiggs was a buddy to almost every man at Quantico, especially the sergeants, and more especially the top kicks. He was quite a sociable cuss. Every night he made the rounds, an old rounder. He started at one end of the post and went to the other, visiting all his old cronies, spending 5 or 6 minutes with each. If he failed to show up at any given time, there was anxiety on the part of the men and a search for Jiggs. This all came under the head of routine in a way, and was what might be known as the private life of Sergeant Major Jiggs. His public career was what seemed to interest him most. He was more at home with the multitudes, a dog among men and women. Wherever he went, Jiggs attracted attention. He accompanied the Marine baseball and football teams on all their journeys north, east, south, and west. He cheered for them, pulled for them, barked heavily over their victories, grit his teeth in the face of their defeat. It was said of Jiggs that he had a fine sense of intuition, that he knew instinctively when the team, baseball or football, was going to win or lose. Members of the football team swear that whenever a touchdown was about to be scored, old Jiggs immediately began to chew on a bench. That he divined the impending score even before spectators, officials, or participants knew what was coming. There is an old sideline bench that does duty in this biggest athletic stadium in Washington, and one end of this has been completely chewed off by Jiggs. It is the bench that did duty when the Marines walloped the Army in football to the tune of 27-7. As soon as touchdowns started coming, or were on their way, Jiggs began chewing the bench. In all his public appearances, Jiggs was in full regalia. He wore with pride his chevrons of a sergeant major, the highest rank held by a non-com. Down at Quantico, there is an official service record book, which was closed with a final entry today, wherein is inscribed all of Jiggs's military record. There was kept entries of his travels, and the allowances and pay duly accorded him as a cog in the great machinery of the Marines. When Jiggs traveled, he went in state. Always on trains where there was an overnight jump, he rode in the Pullman cars. His sleeping quarters were in the smoker, where usually the grinning Georges shake down the seat and turn it into a cot for their own comfort. But one look at Jiggs and any self-respecting porter always made a hasty exit from the smoker, and usually was never seen until the train reached its destination or Jiggs got off. Consequently, whenever the officers and men of Quantico traveled with Jiggs, they were always minus the services of a Pullman porter. With his service cap tipped rakishly over his right eye, the brilliant brass of his collar shined to the burnishing point, and his chevrons and metal bedecking his blanket, old Jiggs cut quite a figure. So much so, in fact, that he was the center of all eyes wherever he appeared. In Grand Central Station, New York, when the Marines were on their way to play the University of Dartmouth the past football season, Jiggs blocked traffic on 7th Avenue when blasé New Yorkers stopped to have a look at him. He reveled in attention. He not only got it, but demanded it. His Marine companions saw that Jiggs was accorded all honors. He is the only dog who ever went in through the front door of Old Madison Square Garden, and the only one who came out the same way. In telling of this, Major J.C. Fagan, who for 5 years traveled with Jiggs, covering more than 100,000 miles by airplane, trains, and trucks, said, "A hard-boiled old doorkeeper at Madison Square Garden, when he wanted to take Jiggs in to hear one of John Philip Sousa's band concerts, for Jiggs was a great lover of music, shouted at Big Jim Ballas, who usually took care of Jiggs, 'Where are you going with that dog?' Ballas told him, 'Into the garden.' 'Oh, no, you're not,' yelled the old man. 'For 20 years I've been on guard here, and no dog has ever come through this front door, not even for a dog show.' 'Well,' said Big Jim Ballas, 'here's where a novelty greets your eyes. This is Sergeant Major Jiggs of the United States Marines, and where he wants to go, he goes.' And Jiggs went in, with about 200 Marines escorting him. Music seems to hurt the ears of dogs, but old Jiggs simply reveled in the strains of a brass band or the tones of an organ. In a parade, he was always 5 or 6 paces ahead of the drum major, keeping step to the rhythmic beat of the drum. The calisthenics of the slide trombone were mystifying to him, and out of the corner of his eye, he always watched the slip horn artist in the band. The piercing notes of the cornet, even when they were sometimes sour, were music to his ear. Down at Quantico, there is an old organ that some of the men play of nights. Always, Jiggs was there to hear the soothing strains of the staid old instrument. He was, too, a movie fan, going with the boys into the darkened hall every night to watch the flickerings on the screen. Especially, he loved to watch the acting of his only rival in public popularity, Rin Tin Tin. Once in a while, when there were pictures of lesser canine celebrities, old Jiggs regarded them disdainfully from the corner of his eye. Most bulldogs are fighters. Though Jiggs was a member of the Fighting Marines, he was only in one fight in all his career with the military organization. He was born too late to see service in the World War, and thus was never in active combat, save on a memorable occasion when the Marines went out to St. Louis to play a football game. There he was nipped by the bear mascot of the state university, who was later sent scurrying to his dugout by the old top sergeant. This was his only scurry, and he came out victorious. He paid no attention whatsoever to the Army mule or the Navy goat. Though both topped him in height, he seemed to consider them beneath him. He was a top sergeant in the Marines, and they were just a goat and a mule. Jiggs had 2 official caretakers. One of them was a sergeant who has spent 29 years of his life following the flag. He is Sergeant John Nicholas, a trooper who has seen service wherever the Marines landed. He was with them in the Boxer Uprising, and has followed the flag over the 7 seas, around the world and back again. Old Sergeant Nick, they say, cried like a baby when Jiggs answered his last call to duty. The second caretaker was Big Jim Ballas, Corporal, the outstanding star pitcher of the Marines. Last year, he pitched 2 no-hit games, and the best rooter he had on the sidelines was Sergeant Major Jiggs, who at the close of every inning ran out to carry in the veteran's glove. Jiggs came by his moniker naturally. There was a cast in his countenance closely resembling that of a celebrated character in the comic strips. Though Jiggs was quite a man with the ladies, petted and pampered by them on all his visits away from the army post, nevertheless, there was in his life no Maggie. A bachelor born, a bachelor he remained. Jiggs was sick only a day. As soon as his symptoms became serious, his buddies rushed him by airplane to Washington, where he was placed in the care of the best veterinarians in the city. He had a trained nurse in attendance upon him in his last hours, and when death finally visited the old boy, his comrades in arms had one of the leading undertakers in the nation's capital take Jiggs's old kennel and make of it a casket. An airplane squadron flew with his remains from Washington to Quantico, Virginia, where the night before his burial, the old sergeant major lay in state. Past the little casket, like those used for little children, 800 men in green uniforms filed to have a last look at their old friend. The next morning, Sergeant Major Jiggs was buried with military honors, his casket covered with the emblem of the Marine Corps and the silken colors, gold and scarlet. They buried him where he spent most of his life with the Marines, on the field of athletics. A simple little mound marks the grave, but soon there will be erected a flitting monument to one of the greatest mascots that ever lived. Members of the Marine Corps have started a campaign to raise funds with which to purchase a headstone for Sergeant Major Jiggs, their friend and companion, now sleeping quietly in the bivouac of the dead.